was watching CJ go over the John 6:44 in the debate. Still, man, I guess I just got really lucky being born an Adventist with the way we read the text, but like, I feel like everybody just confuses everything so badly. So, like, again, one thing that I'm thoroughly convinced of, or I see, is that, which most people don't do this, or many people don't do this, but it's like John 6:44 is clearly compatible with the Calvinist reading of their sort of systematic theology. It just doesn't demand it. So if you think that verse proves like that Calvinists are right about everything, it just doesn't say that. Like there's like a ton of options of how you could read that based on the context. I think Leighton's example is pretty good. I think the idea would be like, so you could, I don't even know, I haven't looked at it again recently or whatever to be sure, but it's probably something like no one can come to me unless the Father draws him. It's like certainly true that they absolutely can't come if they're not one of the ones that is drawn by the Father. It's absolutely true that when the ones whom the Father draws, it is absolute certain. There's no like possibility of not coming. That's what the text is saying on a basic level, which is obviously compatible with Calvinism, but it doesn't demand it. It's just like, it's not saying, it's just not doing that much work. It's just saying the ones in view here are certainly for sure, the ones who come, and they're the ones who are drawn by the Father, period. End of story. No maybe, might be suggested in the use of those words, how that works. It's certainly true, but it doesn't prove irresistible grace or unconditional election or irresistible grace, basically, or or total depravity for that matter. But it's obviously it's a good verse to go with that idea. It just doesn't demand it. And if you think it demands it, I think that's the problem. It would be a problem. But usually this is the verse that Calvinists harp on about how it proves like, most of their specific distinctive doctrines. And I would say it kind of sounds that way, but I would say, but let's look closer. Like, what can we pull together about God's character and the way he operates and is complaining about stuff and is saying out like, I'm long suffering. Like, it really doesn't make sense if the text wants to sort of like shuffle us along so that we slowly get clever and pick up that God's actually determining everything. Ha ha ha. It's like, there's just too much other stuff going on in the text that's consistent with the rest of the text to suggest to me that there's no way that's what the author's thinking. Although it's still true that God's in charge. He's wise. He sees the future. And as far as like, maybe he sees everything in the future, I don't know. Probably not if it means he determines everything, but probably yes if it means you think he doesn't know something that other people would say he does. We don't, but honestly, at the end of the day, nobody actually knows how that works, or if open theism or hardcore Calvinism was actually true. But I'm just going to go off by like the way the author intends to present the characters in the text. So to me, it's just like, when you carefully analyze, excuse me, when you carefully analyze, I think in Leighton's book is ultimately one of the better explanations. Like the idea would be the ones who are being drawn are recognized. Essentially, like if you want to put it in a nutshell, I'd say it's something like this. God was foreseeing how they would disobey. Moses even predicts this sort of thing in Deuteronomy 30, whatever it is, Deuteronomy 30, I think. Because God predicts it kind of in passing, and then Moses predicts it, tells them, and then Moses dies, right? And then, of course, this happens. So God saw it coming a mile away. And so, like, seems to me like, does that mean it was determined? Well, I don't think it was causally determined by God. I think he saw it coming. If that means determinism for you, I guess so. But I don't think like if he hadn't said they were going to disobey, he was saying they were going to disobey because he could tell by the way they're acting that they weren't going to be faithful. Maybe they could have surprised God, but it didn't take him by surprise, and he predicted it. But I don't even think Calvinists would want to say that God's knowledge or declaration of something is necessarily causal. I mean, obviously, if that's the case, then it is determinism. But I don't think most people want to say that that's how it operates. Because every time I try to say it seems like you're trying to say that, Calvinists, they say, actually, no, we're not saying God's knowledge is what's causative. Okay, good. So then it's obviously open to be seen whether or not you can't argue that God knowing for certain that it was causal. Then good.
That's obviously possible, but I'm saying it doesn't demand that. But when God, when you look at the problem, what Jesus is rebuking them for, it's like what he says, like in many different cases, the way I see it is that there's nothing to suggest that God made them reject Jesus. And the reason the ones who are being drawn by the Father are drawn by the Father is because it's ultimately, sorry to get to the point, they are able to see that who the Father is because they knew the Father, and so they can recognize Jesus because he and the Father are one. Because if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. But these rebellious ones that are self-interested and haven't been heeding God's warnings that God predicted would happen, they're not being drawn by the Father because they were set up by their own rejection of God in the past. That's the context of the more greater context here. And so the ones who do come, it's absolutely because the Father draws them. How? They absolutely see that the Father and Jesus are one, and they actually have the love of the Father in them. So to them, Jesus is who they're looking for. And so, I mean, that's still compatible with a really hardcore Calvinist reading, but that's perfectly capable with, it just doesn't say those details. You have to kind of nip them out or whatever. To me, it's intuitively obvious that with the way Jesus responds to these people, like they deserve to be chastised, not because he picked them to not believe, but because they ought to have believed and they ought have heeded God's warning. And so Jesus treats them more harshly than to say a sinner on the street who he hangs out with. He doesn't like people sinning, but the ones that can humble themselves, right, and admit they're sinners, he can work with. He came for the not for the righteous man, right, but for the sinner. These Pharisees are like the worst of the worst. Why? God, what do you think? God wasn't trying to convince them, wasn't long suffering with them, wasn't trying to break their stiff neck and their hearts of stone. You don't think God did any actual work in some of them, maybe over the time, and then some of those ones actually did end up believing? Or think it's all a dog and pony show? No. It really comes down to whether or not they care about. Jesus said, you don't receive me because you want the honor from one another and the honor that comes from men. It's very similar to Satan, right? They want status. But what did Jesus do? He serves. And he comes representing the Father in all his glory as a giving, suffering servant that saves, only uses his powers to heal people and save people. And he tells them, he's like, look, you don't recognize me because you don't have the love of the Father in you. I come in my Father's name, but you come in your own name because you want the honor from men, but I come seeking the honor which is from the only God. And then what does he say? He says, if another one, like another sort of messianic figure comes, in him you will receive because he comes in his own name. And by the way, the name is in Jesus of the Father sent, right? It has very similar sort of idea to, well, it's clearly he's linking it to like a final apostasy and Antichrist, but it won't happen to the Jews per se. It'll be, well, it's already come, it's a apostate Christianity. And people who want status, like they don't really care what God said. They don't care if everybody around them pressures them and everybody else is doing it a certain way, even though they know in their heart, like Jesus is Lord of the seventh day Sabbath. But everybody cool around them and everybody pressuring around them, they don't want to, they're not really dedicated to doing what God said in spite of what men think. They care more about that. And so they like, teach doctrines of men instead of the commandments of God, making of none effect. They literally will like replace things that God said to do because it's easier, because they don't want to be called a cult. And so they'll just say, I know Jesus didn't change it, but everybody's doing it, so I'm probably good. I believe the right doctrine, so I'll just not obey God because I really want to look cool in front of everybody, not take the hard road. Things like that, right? That's what he's rebuking them for. So they just couldn't do it. But it wasn't God's doing. It was their own decision. And so, but Jesus still pled with some of them, wept over them. But then some of them did come around, like Nicodemus, right? Oh, I just want to remind I wanted to remind you of something, CJ. This is for CJ. Fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the earth, the sea, and the fountains of water, because he's coming back soon. Fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of mankind.